With the amazing Le Mans 24 Virtual taking place last weekend, I'm in somewhat of a Le Mans mood. The race at the weekend was without doubt the best esports coverage I have ever seen. It felt like I was watching the actual Le Mans 24 hours with guest appearances from legends such as Derek Bell, Henri Pescarolo and Tom Christensen, to name but a few. 2020 also marks 50 years since Porsche won their first ever Le Mans, and as Porsche are one of my favourite car brands, I thought I would do a celebration of not only Porsche but Le Mans in general. In this video I'm going to drive one car from each decade that the legendary race has taken part in, up the Goodwood Festival of Speed hill climb, and see how they compare to each other and also the other cars that we have driven up the hill already. I think this is going to be one of my favourite episodes so far. Let's start with the 1928 Mercedes-Benz SSK. Technically this car didn't race at Le Mans until 1930, however it was raced in the 1920s by Mercedes in Grand Prix and other motor racing events. With the Wall Street crash of 1929, Mercedes-Benz closed its works racing team, but Alfred Neubauer, the team manager, convinced the board to fund a privateer team. The SSK was designed by Ferdinand Porsche and had a power output of nearly 300 brake horsepower thanks to a supercharger which was switched on periodically, as when it was on it increased fuel consumption massively. Without the supercharger, the car produced around 170 brake horsepower from its 7.1 litre engine. The car had a top speed of 120 miles per hour and was the fastest car of its time. Sadly, in the 1930 Le Mans, the car retired after 12 hours with electrical problems. Let's see how quickly it can go up the Goodwood Festival of Speed hill climb. The 1928 Mercedes-Benz SSK did the Goodwood Festival of Speed hill climb in 70.61 seconds. That currently puts this car last on our leaderboard, which isn't surprising really, as it is definitely the oldest car we have driven up the hill so far. That being said, I really enjoyed driving this car. It felt like I was going for a leisurely cruise and I wasn't having to think as quickly as I do in some of the faster cars. I could see myself coming back to this car on a more open track or something like the LA Canyons mod where you drive along a road. Next up is one of the most famous cars of all time, the Bentley Blower 4.5 litre. If someone is into cars, my guess would be that they have at least heard of a Bentley Blower. During the mid-1920s, a group of wealthy British men got together with Bentley and decided that they wanted to win at Le Mans. They became known as the Bentley Boys and built the Bentley 4.5 litre. But Sir Henry Birking, one of the Bentley boys, wanted to get more performance out of the engine, so he attached a supercharger to the car, creating the now famous Bentley Blower. The engine produced 240 brake horsepower in the racing version and 175 brake horsepower in the road version, which was one of the only cars at the time able to reach 100 miles per hour on the road. Sir Henry Birking came second at the 1930 French Grand Prix, but sadly retired at Le Mans that year after 20 hours with an engine problem. Apparently at top speed, the Bentley blowers would consume 4 litres of fuel each minute, and to put that into perspective, the Bugatti Veyron at top speed consumes 5.3 litres per minute, which would drain its 26.4 gallon fuel tank in 12 minutes. I think it's time to see how quickly the Bentley blower can get up the Goodwood Festival of Speed hill climb. The 1930 Bentley blower 4.5 litre did the Goodwood Festival of Speed hill climb in 75.76 seconds. That means it's below the Mercedes SSK and now sits at the bottom of our leaderboard. I'm not surprised that it's slower than the Merc, to be honest. It didn't feel as easy to drive, but 5 seconds slower is quite a lot on such a short course, and I wasn't expecting it to be that different. In 1939, with the outbreak of World War II, the 24 Hours of Le Mans saw a 10-year hiatus, which means only one race took place during the 1940s. Amazingly, I've been able to find a car that raced in that event, the talbot-lago T26. The only caveat is that the one raced at Le Mans was a coupe called the Grand Sport Coupe, but essentially underneath it was a very similar car to the 1948 Grand Prix car that I'm driving. It was fitted with a 4.5 litre inline-six engine that produced around 280 brake horsepower. Although none of the talbot-lago T26s finished at the 1949 Le Mans, they did win the 1950 race, with Lois and Jean-Louis Rosier at the wheel. Let's see how quickly it can do the Goodwood Festival of Speed hill climb. The 1948 talbot-lago T26C did the Goodwood Festival of Speed hill climb in 67.12 seconds. That time puts it third from bottom on our leaderboard. This car was one of the hardest cars I've ever driven. The rear end felt like it was on a cloud. Every time you put down the throttle it snapped on you, so I was rarely past half throttle for most of this run. I'm sure I could have gone quicker had I driven it more, but that's not what this series is about. Now we're into the 1950s, an era of the British car manufacturer dominating Le Mans, with 6 out of the 10 races being won by either Jaguar or Aston Martin. I've already driven the 1959 Le Mans winner, the Aston Martin DBR1, so today I'm going to be driving arguably one of the prettiest cars to be built, the Jaguar D-Type. The D-Type won Le Mans in 3 consecutive years from 1955 to 1957. We are going to be driving the 1956 winner XKD 606, which was driven by Ron Flockhart and Ninian Sanderson. The D-Type is powered by a 3.4 litre straight-six engine, which was produced by Jaguar from 1949 to 1992 in various displacements. The engine produced around 250 brake horsepower, and because of its aerodynamic shape would go on to a top speed of over 170 miles per hour. Let's see how quickly this gorgeous car can get up the Duke of Richmond's driveway. The 1956 Jaguar D-Type did the Goodwood Festival of Speed hill climb in 58.10 seconds. That puts it 52nd on our leaderboard between the Lamborghini Countach and the Aston Martin DB5, which have times of 57 seconds and 58.94 seconds respectively. The D-Type was as beautiful to drive as it is to look at. It's a car that I hadn't driven before in Assetto Corsa, but one that I can see myself driving more in the coming weeks. Didn't it sound awesome as it was going up the hill? The swinging 60s, a decade of the Beatles, miniskirts and sexual liberation, would also see one team become seemingly unbeatable at Le Mans: Ferrari. From 1960 to 1965, Ferrari won every race at Le Mans until Ford eventually beat them in 1966 and finished off the decade with victories. I could drive the Ford GT40 for this decade, but I want to do a separate video on that car, so instead I'm driving the Ferrari 250 LM. It was a Ferrari 250 LM that won the 1965 Le Mans for the North American racing team, and quite sadly I think be the last win for Ferrari at Le Mans to this date. The car was designed to replace the 250 GTO as a GT racer, but the FIA refused to homologate it as Ferrari hadn't built the required 100 cars, so instead it had to run in the prototype category until it was homologated in 1966. It was powered by a 3.3 litre V12 which produced 320 brake horsepower. The Ferrari 250 LM is one of the most valuable cars in the world, with examples typically selling at auction for more than $10 million. A pre-warning about the replay for this run: for some reason the car kept phasing out in the replay and all you can see is the driver. Anyway, I wonder how quickly it can go up the Goodwood Festival of Speed hill climb. The 1963 Ferrari 250 LM did the Goodwood Festival of Speed hill climb in 59.73 seconds. 56th is where that puts the 250 LM on our leaderboard, 0.16 seconds behind the 250 GTO and 0.62 seconds ahead of the Aston Martin DBR1. This was a weird car to drive. I know that it has a lot more time in it, but I just couldn't seem to get a nice feel. As with a lot of cars that I drive in this series, I'm sure that with more time behind the wheel, I'd be able to get quicker. And now for my favourite racing car of all time, the Porsche 917K. This car is serving a few purposes today. First of all, it was this car that won Porsche's first victory at Le Mans in 1970. It was also designed by Hans Mezger, who sadly passed away on the 10th of June, and so this run is also a tribute to him. An incredible engineer and the beating heart of Porsche motorsport, as he designed not only race cars but also the engines that went in them, including the 6-cylinder boxer engine used in the 911s, the flat 12 in the 917 and the 1.5 litre V6 turbo engine used by McLaren in the 1980s, with which they won the 1984, 85 and 86 Drivers' Championships and the 1984 and 85 Constructors' Championship. The 917 had a tricky beginning in 1969, with drivers complaining of instability and worst of all, unpredictability. It was found that the car wasn't producing enough downforce to keep the rear tyres stuck to the ground, but despite that, driver Richard Attwood was leading the race at the 21-hour mark when his gearbox broke. Attwood would later say that he was glad when it broke down. Despite its unruly nature, there was no denying that the 917 was quick, with it clocking in at 19 miles per hour quicker on the Mulsanne straight than anything else running that year. In 1970, a modification was made to the tail of the car to produce more downforce, and it was dubbed the 917K, with the K standing for Kerchak or short tail. The 917K won 7 of the 8 events entered in that season, including Le Mans, at the hands of Richard Attwood and Hans Hermann, and it was clear that this car would become legendary. Legend status was beyond doubt when the king of cool, Steve McQueen, drove one in his 1971 film Le Mans. As I said, this car is my favourite racing car of all time, especially in those iconic Gulf oil colours, and I'm unlikely to be able to get to experience one in real life, so to get to experience it in VR with my sim rig is amazing. Let's see how quickly the Porsche 917K can drive the 1.16 miles at Goodwood. The 1970 Porsche 917K did the Goodwood Festival of Speed hill climb in 48.49 seconds. That puts it 39th on our leaderboard. I think this is a very respectable time and position for this car. It is sitting 0.29 seconds behind the 2013 Aston Martin Vantage GTE and 0.8 seconds ahead of the Dodge Viper ACR. Considering the car is now 50 years old, I think it has done itself proud. Sticking with Porsche, the car representing the 1980s is the 1986 Le Mans winner, the Porsche 962C, driven by Derek Bell, Hans-Joachim Stuck and Al Holbert. The 80s was an era of turbos, with F1 cars hitting over 1,000 brake horsepower and sports prototypes not far behind. 1982 also saw the introduction of the Group C category of racing at Le Mans and is arguably the peak of endurance racing. This was the era of the Rothmans Porsches, silk-cut Jaguars, Martini Lancias and Minolta Toyotas. I would love to see these cars racing today at historic events. The Porsche 962 was built to replace the 956, which was banned from the American IMSA series on safety grounds. The 962 was fitted with a 3-litre twin-turbocharged flat 6 and produced up to 700 brake horsepower and had a top speed of around 360 km per hour or 224 miles per hour. Let's see how fast it can be driven up the Goodwood Festival of Speed hill climb. The 1986 Porsche 962C Longtail did the Goodwood Festival of Speed hill climb in 44.75 seconds. That puts it 23rd on our leaderboard, 0.8 seconds ahead of the Mazda 787B and 0.19 seconds behind the Ferrari 312 T6. This is one of my favourite cars to drive in this game, and it feels so rewarding when you put a really good lap together. Moving into the 90s, and after the fall of Group C racing, the endurance world turned more towards GT cars. McLaren built the F1 GTR, Porsche built the 911 GT1, and Mercedes had the CLK GTR to meet these new requirements. However, as much as I wanted to drive another Porsche, I decided to choose the 1998 Toyota GT1. This car is gorgeous and is one of my favourite looking racing cars of all time. It was driven in period by Martin Brundle, another reason that I wanted to drive this car. The GT1 had a 3.6 litre twin turbocharged V8 which produced around 600 brake horsepower. Sadly, in 1998, Martin Brundle's car, along with one of its sister cars, had to retire from the Le Mans 24, with the other GT1 coming in 9th position. In 1999, Martin Brundle's car would retire once again, but the same all-Japanese driven car that finished 9th in the previous year's race would finish 2nd, less than a lap behind the leading BMW. Time to see how quick it is up the hill. The 1998 Toyota GT1 did the Goodwood Festival of Speed hill climb in 44.98 seconds. That puts it directly behind the Porsche 962C and ahead of the Mazda 787B. This was another interesting car to drive because for some reason the revs hit the limiter in what felt like a really weird place. I'm sure I could fiddle around with the gears individually, but in this series I tried to keep the cars as similar as possible by running default setups and only changing the final drive when it comes to gear ratios. Moving into a new century now and representing the years 2000 to 2009 is the 2003 Le Mans winner, the Bentley Speed 8. This car, along with the Peugeot 908 HDI, stopped Audi getting a 15-year streak of wins at Le Mans from the year 2000 to 2014. I love seeing this car at events. I saw it at Goodwood a couple of years ago and it was just magical to see. The Bentley Speed 8 that I'm driving today is the number 8 car from the 2003 race, driven by Mark Blundell, David Brabham and Johnny Herbert. This car came second behind its sister car, which gave Tom Christensen his 5th win at Le Mans. The Bentley Speed 8 houses a 4-litre twin-turbocharged V8 inside its streamlined body and has a power output of around 615 brake horsepower. This car looks fast standing still, so I can't wait to see how quickly it can go up the hill. The 2003 Bentley Speed 8 did the Goodwood Festival of Speed hill climb in 42.58 seconds. With that time, the Bentley Speed 8 goes 18th on our leaderboard. Ahead of it by 1.17 seconds is the Lotus 98T, and behind it is the Williams FW08B. This was another really nice car to drive, and I look forward to driving it some more in some races soon. We couldn't make a video about Le Mans without driving a car from the second most successful manufacturer in the history of the race, Audi. Audi have won 13 races out of the 18 that they entered, and incredibly have 2 runs of 5 consecutive wins before being toppled off of the top step of the podium. The car that will represent the 2010s is the 2014 Audi R18 e-tron Quattro. This car would bring Audi their last victory at Le Mans before retiring from the sport at the end of 2016. The 2014 R18 is an evolution of a car that was first introduced in 2011. It contained a 4-litre V6 turbo diesel engine that produced 514 brake horsepower, which was combined with a hybrid system adding an extra 469 brake horsepower, making the total power output of this car 983 horsepower. Time to test it at Goodwood. The 2014 Audi R18 e-tron Quattro did the Goodwood Festival of Speed hill climb in 40.44 seconds. That puts it 16th on our leaderboard. The McLaren MP413 is ahead of it, and the Lotus Exos 125 is behind it. I didn't like this car as much as the Porsche 919 hybrid, and both are official Kunos cars and not mods. The Audi felt planted, but it was missing something compared to the Porsche, which ended up being nearly 3 seconds quicker. Let's have a quick look at our Le Mans leaderboard. The Porsche 919 Evo has been excluded from this list as it never raced at Le Mans, so our top spot is currently held by the 2016 Porsche 919 Hybrid, followed not very closely by the 2014 Audi R18. The Bentley tops the Lola Aston Martin by nearly 3/4 of a second, and the Porsche 962C is punching well above its weight in terms of its age. We then have the 2 Japanese cars from Toyota and Mazda, followed in 8th by the Sauber C9. It's a shame the 917K didn't make it up into the top 8, but when you think that it's 19 years older than the car in 8th place, it was a bit of a long stretch. I hope you've enjoyed this look back at the history of Le Mans, seeing some of its most iconic competitors driving up the hill at Goodwood. I've certainly enjoyed driving them, and I hope that I can get to Le Mans next year to watch the race in person. See you next time. Bye bye.